All right, strap in, everybody. Today's deep dive is going to be about something I bet you don't think about too much. It's sewer pricing in Abu Dhabi.
Yeah, not the most glamorous topic, true. But trust me, it gets really interesting, surprisingly complex even.
For this one, we've got a whole stack of government box all about how they're going to set the very first price controls ever for the Abu Dhabi Sewage Services Company.
ADSSC.
Yeah, ADSSC for short. So have you ever wondered how a place with only one sewer company can make sure that the prices stay fair? Well, we're about to find out how they're tackling that right here in Abu Dhabi.
It's a classic monopoly, right? I mean, you don't want to have 5 different sewer companies all digging up the streets.
Yeah, makes sense.
So the government steps in and uses these price controls. They try to protect the consumers, of course, from unfair pricing. But they're also trying to be sure that the subsidies they provide are used efficiently.
So it's a bit of a balancing act.
Yeah.
Trying to make sure that ADSSC can keep operating and investing in improvements, but also making sure our sewer bills don't go crazy.
Exactly. And the way they're going to do this is through what's called CPI-X regulation.
Okay, CPI. Now that sounds familiar. Is that the Consumer Price Index?
Uh-huh.
The one that tracks inflation?
You got it.
Okay.
So it's already used in Abu Dhabi for water and electricity.
Oh, okay.
And basically what it means is ADSSC's price increases are tied to inflation, but then they take away a factor X to try to encourage efficiency. So it's kind of like saying, okay, prices can go up with inflation, but you've also got to find ways to save money, become more efficient.
So it's not just a free pass for ADSSC to raise prices whenever.
Exactly. This X factor keeps the pressure on them to control their costs.
Okay.
Interestingly, ADSSC actually initially pushed back on this a little.
Really?
They said that CPI doesn't fully reflect the cost of things like construction, but it seems like in the end, those concerns were addressed.
I see. I agree. So how long will these price controls be in effect? Like what sort of time frame are we talking about?
So this very first one's going to run from June 21, 2005 to December 31st, 2009.
Okay.
Seems kind of random, but it lines up with the review schedule for other utility companies. So they're kind of trying to, streamline everything.
Okay, very organized. Makes sense. Now, I noticed in these documents they talk about possibly having separate price controls for, all the different parts of ADSSC's business, but ultimately they decided to just go with a single control for everything. Why is that?
Yeah, initially they were thinking about separate controls for the sewerage business, the wastewater treatment, and the disposal business.
Okay.
But there have been some delays in new treatment works coming online, so they figured, well, for now, one control should be enough.
Makes sense. Makes sense. So how do they go about actually calculating these price controls? I'm guessing it's a pretty complicated process.
It is. It's multi-layered, we could say. They look at several key factors. One of the first things they look at is ADSSC's operating expenses, or OPEX. That's basically just the cost of running the business. And that's actually where things get a bit tricky.
What makes it so tricky?
Well, for one thing, ADSSC is a relatively new company. It's only established in 2005.
Okay.
And plus, they're expecting to grow a lot. So trying to, predict their future costs is a bit of a guessing game. A lot of variables at play.
I bet it. I can imagine that's a tough job for the people trying to set those prices.
Yeah, you can see that. So the RSB, they decided to use something called a top-down approach. What they do is they allow ADSSC to recover their actual operating costs from 2005 to 2007. But then for 2008 and 2009, they used this weighted average of the 2006 audited costs and the 2007 unaudited costs to kind of establish a baseline. So they're looking at those actual costs, but they're also kind of, trying to factor in those potential increases due to that growth we talked about.
So a mix of looking at the past and making some educated guesses about the future.
Right. But get this. ADSSC, they initially said they had concerns about this approach. They said, well, our costs were lower during the startup phase, so if you use these more recent figures, it might make things look artificially inflated.
So maybe trying to get a bit of a more favorable price control there.
Possibly. But the RSB's method actually addresses that concern because it incorporates those lower startup costs. But it gets even more interesting because when they really dug into the numbers, the RSB found some, let's say, interesting discrepancies in ADSSC's financials.
Okay, spill the tea. What kind of discrepancies are we talking?
Well, for example, ADSSC's projected operating expenses for 2007 were a whole 68% higher than their actual expenses for 2006.
Wait, 68%? That's a huge difference. So were they maybe intentionally, padding their budget, trying to get more leeway with the price controls?
Makes you wonder, doesn't it? And the RSB even noted that companies in this sector rarely actually hit those really aspirational targets that they set in their budgets.
Yeah, so it's a bit suspicious, but did the RSD just take their word for it, or did they do some, independent checking on those numbers?
No, they didn't just take their word for it. They actually went and did this benchmarking analysis. So they compared ADSSC's costs, like per employee per kilometer of their network, and per customer to other similar businesses.
Smart. So how did they compare?
It's a mixed bag, actually. Their staff costs and the expenses per kilometer of network were much higher than those benchmarks.
Not a great look.
But their operating expenses per customer ratio was actually comparable.
Okay, so maybe there's some, justification for those higher expenses. Maybe they're dealing with a more complex network or something.
Could be. Could be. But the RSB didn't stop there. To kind of nudge ADSSC toward being more efficient, they also added a 5% efficiency improvement factor to their OPEX projections for 2008 and 2009. So it's like they're saying, we think you guys can do better.
Giving them a little extra incentive to really tighten their belts.
Exactly.
So besides these operating expenses, what are the other pieces of the puzzle that go into calculating these price controls?
The next big one is the initial regulatory asset value, RAV. Basically, the value of all of ADSSC's existing assets, pipes, the treatment plants, everything. And guess what? Figuring that out was no easy feat.
I'm sensing a theme here. Sewer pricing. Way more complicated than it sounds.
You got it. It's not like there's a Kelly Blue Book for sewer infrastructure.
Right.
So how do you put a price tag on something like a vast network of pipes buried underground?
Yeah. What did they end up doing?
Well, they decided to go with kind of a practical solution. They used ADSSC's audited asset value that was already on their books as the initial RAV.
Okay. A reasonable starting point, I suppose. But of course, ADSSC can't just keep operating on existing infrastructure forever. They're going to have to invest in some upgrades, expansions down the line, right?
Absolutely. And how they regulate those investments is actually super important because it can really encourage responsible spending. The RSB decided to go with what's called an ex post approach.
Ex post.
Ex post.
Okay. In plain English, what does that mean?
It means that they don't try to, predict ADSSC's future capital expenditures up front.
Oh.
Instead, ADSSC can just recover the costs of those investments after they've been made.
So they get reimbursed later.
Yeah.
What's the thinking behind that?
Well, it avoids having to, guess about what their future investment needs will be. And it ensures that they get compensated for those investments, which encourages them to, invest efficiently.
So it's a win-win, really.
Yeah, in theory. But of course, it relies on ADSSC, providing accurate and transparent information about their spending. And if we take a look at the capital expenditure plans ADSSC initially put forward, let's just say they were rather ambitious.
Ambitious? How?
Their projections for capital expenditure were pretty hefty.
Okay.
But they later admitted that these plans were overly aggressive and, they were based more on what they thought the system needed rather than, what they could actually handle realistically.
So a bit of overpromising, maybe. Not exactly building trust there.
Right. And to make matters worse, a large chunk of that projected spending also depended on projects by external developers, which adds a whole other level of uncertainty.
Yeah, it's not even fully under their control at that point. So what did the RSB do about that? I'm assuming they didn't just blindly accept those projections.
Of course not. They took a more, let's say, judicious approach, and they used a provisional CapEx estimate for their calculations.
Makes sense. Don't want to just throw money at the problem without knowing for sure.
Right. It's all about finding that balance, right? Investing in the future, but also being responsible. And this is where it gets even more interesting. The whole debate over depreciation.
Depreciation. Isn't that just an accounting thing? How do you even debate that?
Well, it's an accounting thing, but it has a very real impact on the prices. It all comes down to how long they expect those sewer assets to actually last.
Okay, tell me more. I'm intrigued.
So the RSB, always thinking long term, right? They argued that these assets should have longer lifespans.
Okay.
For example, they said that sewer pipes could last for over 100 years.
100 years. With proper maintenance, I guess.
If they're well maintained, exactly. But ADSSC disagreed.
Okay.
They argued for much shorter lifespans.
Okay.
25 years for those pipes. They said the UAE environment's really harsh. And, the quality of materials used in the past wasn't always great.
Right. So their argument is that their infrastructure is going to age faster. But how does that affect the price controls?
It has a direct impact. Shorter lifespans equal higher depreciation costs. And ADSSC would then need to recover those costs through higher prices. So the RSB, by pushing for these longer lifespans, they're basically trying to keep those costs down.
So they're looking out for us, the consumers, even when it comes to the stuff we don't really want to think about.
Exactly. Plus, they're trying to keep things consistent across Abu Dhabi's utility sector. They pointed out that the water companies in the Emirate, they already use asset lives of up to 40 years in their accounting.
So ADSSC is the outlier in this case.
You could say that. And that back and forth over the depreciation rates definitely had an impact on those final price control calculations. But wait, there's more. We can't forget about the cost of capital.
Okay, now we're getting into the nitty-gritty finance stuff.
It's not that complicated. Basically, the cost of capital is the return that ADSSC needs to make on its investments to attract investors and, keep the lights on. Think of it like their minimum profit margin for staying financially healthy.
Okay, makes sense. How do they even go about figuring that out?
They used a pretty standard model called the Capital Asset Pricing Model, CAPM.
Okay,
It's the same approach used for other utilities in Abu Dhabi, so it makes sense to keep things consistent.
makes sense, yeah. But what's the catch? There's always a catch, right?
Well, there might be one. It seems like the cost of capital for ADSSC could actually be lower than previously estimated.
Oh, really? Why is that?
A couple of factors. First, recent credit rating developments suggest that ADSSC is seen as a safer investment now. And safer investments usually mean a lower cost of capital.
So they're seen as like more reliable, less risky.
Exactly. Plus, the RSB looked at decisions made by regulators in other countries like Australia and the UK, and they're allowing lower rates of return for similar utilities.
Ah, so they're taking a global perspective.
Yeah, making sure they're being fair and competitive.
Smart. But how does a lower cost of capital actually affect us, the people who use the sewers?
Well, that's good news for your wallet.
Okay, good.
A lower cost of capital means lower allowed profits for ADSSC, which ultimately leads to lower prices for consumers. It's all connected.
I like the sound of that. Now, we've talked about operating expenses, asset values, depreciation, cost of capital. My brain is like full of financial terms right now. How does all this come together to actually determine that final price control?
Yeah,
It's like we've gathered all these ingredients, but we haven't baked the cake yet.
I like that analogy. And to bake this cake, we're going to need to use the magic of net present value, or NPV.
NPV, another acronym to add to our list. What is that?
It sounds a little bit intimidating, but it's a pretty simple concept. Basically, it's all about figuring out what all those future costs and revenues from ADSSC's operations, what are they actually worth in today's money?
So you're taking a long-term view instead of just looking at it year by year.
Exactly. And the RSB uses what you call a building blocks approach.
Okay. Building blocks like Legos. I can understand that.
Yeah, exactly like that. They take all the projected costs, operating expenses, depreciation, return on capital, all those things. Those are the basic building blocks.
Makes sense. Then what?
They have to bring all those costs back to their present value. They use this technique called discounting, and that means taking into account things like inflation and interest rates.
Wait. Hold on. Time out. Time value of money. You're going to have to explain that one.
Think about it this way. If you won the lottery and it was going to pay you $1 million over 20 years, it wouldn't be worth $1 million to you today. So that's what NPV helps us understand. What's that future stream of payments really worth right now? And it considers things like inflation and interest rates.
Oh, okay. So like comparing apples to apples, bringing everything back to the same baseline.
Exactly. So by discounting all those future costs and revenues, they can figure out what's the maximum allowed revenue, or MR, that ADSSC can earn each year. And that MR becomes like a ceiling. They can't go above that.
So that's the final price control.
Pretty much, yeah. And they calculate that MR for each year of the price control period. And it's supposed to be enough for ADSSC to cover their costs, earn that fair return, and importantly, provide a fair price to the consumers, us.
I think it's all starting to come together now, but this seems like a very passive system, doesn't it? Like, is there anything that actually motivates ADSSC to go above and beyond to actually try and improve their performance?
You're right, just setting a price ceiling isn't really enough. That's where the Performance Incentive Scheme, PIS, comes in.
Okay, so tell me about this PIS. How do they plan to actually incentivize ADSSC to do a good job?
So they realized they needed something more. Just controlling the revenue wasn't going to be enough to actually drive real improvements. So they created this PIS to try to encourage ADSSC to excel, to go above and beyond, and not just in those financial areas.
So rewarding them for doing a good job, not just preventing them from doing a bad job.
You got it. And the scheme's built around two main categories of performance indicators.
Okay, let's hear about these categories. What are they?
So the first one, Category A, that focuses on how timely they are with certain submissions, their audited accounts, performance reports, and something called the Annual Information Statement, AIS.
Okay.
So it's all about making sure they're on top of their paperwork.
No dragging their feet on those important reports.
Exactly. And then Category B, this one is where it gets more interesting. This one measures their performance on things like system efficiency, customer service, and environmental impact. So things like reducing water leakage, keeping those odor complaints down to a minimum, and maximizing the recycling of that treated wastewater.
So it's all about rewarding them for being good environmental stewards and for providing really great service to the customers.
Precisely.
So I'm assuming both of these categories have, rewards for good performance and maybe penalties for bad performance.
You got it. For Category A, the penalties are pretty straightforward. If ADSSC submits something late, they basically lose out on a portion of those potential incentives, and it's based on how many months late they are.
So the longer they delay, the more it costs them. But is there like a limit to how much they can lose?
Yeah, there is a cap. It's like a safety net, I guess, to prevent things from getting too crazy. So the penalty can't exceed what they would have lost if they were a whole year late. So worst case scenario, they miss out on a year's worth of incentives.
All right, so a system of carrots and sticks, but those sticks have a limit. Now, what about Category B? What are the rewards and penalties for that category?
That one's a little more nuanced. Their performance on those Category B measures is actually assessed at the next price control review.
Ah, so it's more of a long-term perspective.
Exactly.
They're judged on their overall performance over a longer period.
That's right. And then good or bad performance there, that could actually potentially impact their pricing in the future. Now, they haven't quite set the exact structure for those rewards and penalties yet, but there is a cap. 2% of their maximum allowed revenue, either up or down, based on how well they perform.
Okay, so there's a real incentive for them to focus on these non-financial performance metrics because it could directly affect their bottom line in the future. Pretty clever system, really. It's not just telling ADSSC what to do, it's trying to give them the incentive to do the right things.
I agree. It's a delicate balance, trying to protect the consumer while also allowing them to operate and invest in the future.
Now, you mentioned something called the Annual Information Statement earlier. What is that exactly?
You can think of it like their grand plan.
Okay.
It's a really comprehensive document filled with all sorts of historical data, future forecasts. It gives the RSB a lot of insight into their development plans, and it helps them assess their investment needs and make good decisions about future price controls.
So it's a pretty important document then. They wouldn't want to mess that one up.
Exactly. And because it is so important, the RSB is actually taking steps to make sure the information in there is really accurate and reliable.
Okay.
But they're actually requiring ADSSC to hire an independent expert to verify all the data in that AIS.
Ah, so like a third-party audit to make sure everything's on the up and up.
Exactly. So it adds another layer of scrutiny, and it, helps prevent ADSSC from maybe fudging the numbers or being a little too optimistic in their projections.
Transparency and accountability, always important, especially when we're talking about something as essential as, sewage.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground here today, but this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? I mean, these documents, they go into incredible detail about the methodology and the assumptions and how they calibrate all these inputs to try to get to a fair and balanced price control.
Oh, yeah.
Fascinating how much goes into something that most of us just never think about.
It really is.
And it really shows how important good regulation is.
Right.
Especially when you're dealing with, these essential services that are provided by monopolies.
Absolutely. And this is really just the beginning. As ADSSC, as they get more experience, as they collect more data, and as Abu Dhabi grows, all these price controls, they're going to be reviewed and adjusted as needed.
It's not just a one-time thing.
No.
It's an ongoing process.
It's a dynamic process, yeah.
Yeah. So before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. It's clear that the RSB is putting a lot of effort into making this a very transparent system. It seems pretty fair. But given that ADSSC does have this monopoly, do you think there should be more public input in this process? Like, would it be beneficial to have more transparency and public participation?
That's a great question. And I think it's one that deserves a lot more discussion.
Yeah, it really makes you think about the balance between having expert regulation and, public involvement. But we'll have to leave that question hanging for now. We've covered a lot already, and there's still more to uncover. So we'll be back soon with part 2 of our deep dive into Abu Dhabi's sewer pricing saga.
Stay tuned, because it only gets more interesting.
Welcome back to our deep dive. We're picking up right where we left off, exploring the fascinating world of sewer pricing in Abu Dhabi. Last time we talked about, how they're going to set the first ever price controls for ADSSC, the only provider of sewer services here in the city.
We really got into it. CPIX regulation, ADSSC's operating expenses, even that debate about, the lifespan of those underground pipes.
Yeah, it's amazing how much goes on below the surface, literally, for something we usually don't think about too much.
Right. But today we're going even deeper, exploring how that final price control is actually calculated.
All right, I'm ready. Last time you mentioned something called net present value, MPD. Sounds like a pretty important part of this.
Yeah, it's really it's the foundation of the whole thing. Remember, we're trying to set a price control that's fair and sustainable, not just for a year, but for several years.
Right, to make sure ADSSC can cover their costs, earn a reasonable return, and have enough money to invest in, upgrades and expansions in the future.
Exactly. MPV helps us do just that. It's basically a way of looking at all those future costs and revenues and saying, what are they actually worth in today's money?
So you're saying like $1 today is worth more than $1 5 years from now because of inflation and stuff?
That's the idea. So how do they actually do this? Well, they start by projecting all those inputs we talked about. Operating expenses, depreciation, capital expenditures, the cost of capital, all the important ingredients for the NPV calculation.
So they're kind of forecasting what ADSSC is going to spend and earn over, like, the whole price control period.
Yep, and then they have to bring all those future cash flows back to their present value. They use this technique called discounting. It's kind of like, imagine taking a time machine back to 2005 and asking, what are all these costs and revenues worth to us right now?
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. It's like, when you see an antique and you think, wow, that must have been worth way less back in the day.
That's a great analogy. Inflation, and earning interest, that means that money loses value over time. A dollar in 2009 is worth less than a dollar in 2005.
So they're adjusting for that when they calculate the price control, making sure ADSSC isn't, like, losing out because of inflation.
Right. Once they discounted everything back to its present value, they can figure out the maximum allowed revenue, the MR, which is the ceiling for what ADSSC can earn each year.
Okay, so it's like setting a budget for them, but a budget that makes sure they can still provide a fair price.
You got it. It's definitely a balancing act. ADSSC has to be able to operate and invest, but consumers need to be protected from, sky-high prices.
It all makes sense now, but whoa, my head's spinning a little bit with all this financial stuff.
Don't worry. Just remember the main idea is to look at the long term, consider how the value of money changes over time, and come up with a price control that's fair to everyone involved.
All right, that helps. So you mentioned that these MARs are initially expressed in 2005 prices. Why is that?
Well, we can't forget about inflation. We have to adjust those MARs to account for inflation so we can see what they'll really look like.
So the actual amount of revenue ADSSC can earn could be different, higher or lower, depending on how much inflation there is over those 4 years.
Exactly. It does add some uncertainty, but it also protects ADSSC from any, sudden spikes in inflation, which could hurt their profitability.
Makes sense. Trying to make the system fair and stable no matter what happens with the economy. Pretty impressive.
They're being very thorough. They want a regulatory framework that will work well, even when things change.
And this isn't like a one-time calculation, right?
Oh, no, this is just the first step. They'll review those price controls regularly, probably every 5 years, just to make sure they're still appropriate.
So as things change, ADSSC gets bigger, upgrades their infrastructure, demand for services goes up. They'll adjust the controls to make sure everything stays balanced.
It's designed to be flexible and adapt as needed.
Okay, good. Now, let's talk a little more about how ADSSC is actually motivated to do a good job. Those performance incentives you mentioned earlier.
Right, that's the Performance Incentive Scheme, or PIS. It's all about encouraging ADSSC to go above and beyond, not just staying under that revenue limit, but really trying to excel.
Okay, refresh my memory. What are those performance categories again?
There are two main categories. Category A is all about being timely with those important documents. Audited accounts, performance reports, the annual information statement. It's about transparency and making sure they're organized.
Yeah, basically stay on top of their paperwork. Makes sense.
Right. And then there's Category B, which is all about performance, the stuff that really matters to consumers.
Okay, that's what I'm interested in. Tell me more about Category B.
This category looks at system efficiency, customer service, and environmental impact. They're trying to minimize leaks, reduce complaints, and make sure they're treating and recycling wastewater efficiently.
So it's like they're not just managing sewage, they're managing their impact, right? Making sure they're doing it in a way that doesn't hurt the environment or bother people.
Exactly. And the PIS rewards them for that. It's a pretty powerful incentive to be good environmental stewards and provide that service.
Yeah. What kind of rewards are we talking about here?
Well, if they do a good job, they could get a bonus of up to 2% on top of their maximum allowed revenue.
Wow, that's a lot of money. They're not messing around with this incentive scheme.
Nope, they're serious about it. And of course, there are penalties too. If they don't hit the targets, they could lose up to 2% of their revenue.
Okay, so there's a real upside and a real downside. It's a balanced approach. Give me some specific examples of what they'll be measuring.
Well, one of the big ones is water leakage. They want to make sure ADSSC is fixing leaks quickly and keeping water loss to a minimum.
Makes sense. Water's precious, especially out here in the desert.
Another one is customer satisfaction. They'll be looking at how many complaints come in, making sure they're responding to concerns, and trying to make people happy.
So they better be ready to deal with that smelly sewer problem quickly.
Hopefully they will. And finally, they'll be measuring how well they treat and recycle wastewater. That means using sustainable practices and minimizing their impact on the environment. It's like we said, it's not just about getting rid of the sewage. It's about doing it the right way, protecting the environment, keeping people happy, and using resources efficiently.
It all ties together. Now, what about that annual information statement, that AIS? You said it's like their roadmap for the future. What's in it?
It's full of data and projections. They're laying out their plans, talking about their investment needs, and giving the RSB a clear picture of what they're thinking.
It's like peeking into their crystal ball, seeing what they envision for the future of Abu Dhabi's sewer system.
Exactly. And that helps the RSB make better decisions about future price controls. They can make sure those controls are aligned with ADSSC's goals and, what the city actually needs.
So it's a way for them to communicate and stay on the same page. Transparency is key.
Right. Now, how do we know the information in the AIS is accurate?
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Seems like there's a lot of room for creative interpretation. Let's call it that.
Well, the RSB is one step ahead. They're requiring ADSSC to get an independent expert, a technical assessor, to verify all that data.
So kind of like having an auditor come in and check their work.
Exactly. That helps to keep things honest and prevent them from, exaggerating or fudging the numbers.
Transparency, accountability, and a little bit of healthy skepticism. Sounds like a good approach to me.
I agree. It helps build trust and make sure everyone is working towards the same goals.
This whole deep dive has been really eye-opening. I mean, who knew sewer pricing could be so complicated, but also so interesting?
It's amazing what you discover when you start digging beneath the surface, even when it comes to things we'd rather not think about.
Right. And it shows how important good regulation is. It's all about balance, making sure ADSSC can operate and invest in the future, but also making sure they're serving the community and protecting the environment.
It's a dynamic system, constantly evolving. And as Abu Dhabi grows, those price controls, those performance targets, they're all going to have to adapt to keep up with the changing needs of the city.
It's a story that's still being written.
Exactly. And we're just getting started. There's a whole other side to this, these performance incentives, and we're going to dive into that next time.
That's right. We'll explore how ADSSC is being challenged to go above and beyond. Stay tuned for the final chapter in our deep dive into Abu Dhabi's sewer pricing saga. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive. We've been talking about sewer pricing in Abu Dhabi, and let me tell you, it's a lot more interesting than I ever imagined.
We've seen how those price controls are calculated, factoring in all those costs, the asset values, even the time value of money.
It's been quite a journey, really, learning about all the financial stuff and the regulations, but you know what? It's actually impressive, all the thought that goes into setting a price for something, well, that we don't think about too often, to be honest.
Yeah, sometimes the most essential services are the ones we take for granted, but it's important to get it right. And that's where good regulation comes in.
Exactly. Now, last time you mentioned something about performance incentives, like there's more to the story than just the financial calculations.
Oh, yeah. That's the part that really, adds a whole other dimension. It's called the Performance Incentive Scheme, or PIS. And it's all about, motivating ADSSC to do more than just stay within those revenue limits, to actually excel.
So like rewarding them for being good, not just preventing them from being bad.
That's the idea. The PIS gives them a reason to really focus on performance in some key areas that affect consumers and the environment.
Okay, I'm all ears. What are those areas, those targets?
Remember those two categories we talked about?
Uh-huh.
Category A, that's all about timely submission of all those documents. That's about transparency and making sure things run smoothly.
Right. Stay organized, get the paperwork is on time.
But Category B, that's the one that gets interesting. This is about actual performance. System efficiency, customer service, and environmental impact.
So making sure the sewer system works well, doesn't smell, and isn't, harming the environment.
You got it. They're looking at things like water leakage, odor complaints, and making sure that wastewater is treated and recycled properly.
It's funny when you think about it, those things, they have a real impact on our lives, our quality of life.
Absolutely. And the PIS, it pushes ADSSC to make those things a priority. It's like saying, hey, you're not just managing sewage, you're managing your impact. Think about the community. Think about the environment.
And I bet there's a nice reward if they do a good job.
There is. They can actually earn an extra 2% on top of their maximum allowed revenue.
Okay, now that's a serious incentive.
It shows you how much they care about these things. They're putting their money where their mouth is, so to speak. But of course, there's a flip side too. If they don't meet the targets, well, they could lose up to 2% of their revenue.
Carrots and sticks, but those carrots look pretty juicy.
It's a balanced approach designed to really motivate them to perform well. It's not just about keeping the business afloat. It's about being a good corporate citizen.
So give me some specifics. What kind of things are they actually being measured on?
One of the key things is water leakage. They want to minimize the amount of water that's lost through leaks.
Yeah, every drop counts out here.
Another one is customer satisfaction. They'll be tracking those complaints, making sure they're addressed quickly and efficiently.
So no more ignoring those calls about a stinky sewer.
Hopefully not. And, of course, they're looking at how they're treating and recycling wastewater. They want to encourage sustainable practices, minimize that environmental impact.
Sounds like they're really trying to make ADSSC a responsible company.
They are, and everyone benefits. ADSSC gets rewarded, the community gets better service, the environment's protected. It's a win-win-win.
Now, how does that annual information statement, the AIS, fit into all this? You said it's like their plan for the future.
It's a really important document. They're basically laying out their vision, what they want to achieve, what investments they need to make.
Like a roadmap for the sewer system.
Exactly. And the RSB, they use that information to make better decisions about future price controls, make sure everything is aligned with the needs of the city.
Makes sense. But how do they make sure the information in the AIS is accurate? I mean, there's always a temptation to maybe embellish a little.
You're right. And they've thought of that. They require ADSSC to hire an independent expert, a technical assessor, to go through everything and make sure it's all legit.
Ah, so they get a second opinion, kind of like an auditor for their plans.
You got it. It adds a layer of accountability and makes sure they're not just making stuff up.
I love it. Transparency, checks and balances, making sure everyone's playing by the rules. This has been a fascinating deep dive. I never thought I'd be so interested in sewer pricing, but here we are.
It just goes to show there's always something interesting to learn if you just dig a little deeper, even in the most, shall we say, unexpected places.
Absolutely. And it's important, right? We all rely on these services, and it's good to know that someone's looking out for us, making sure things are fair and sustainable.
That's what good regulation is all about, protecting consumers, protecting the environment, and ensuring these essential services can continue to operate and meet the needs of the community.
Well said. Well, I think we've covered it all, the ins and outs of sewer pricing in Abu Dhabi. We've learned about the financial calculations, the performance incentives, and the importance of transparency and accountability.
It's a complex system, but it's designed to be fair and effective. And as Abu Dhabi continues to grow, it'll be interesting to see how this system evolves.
It's a story that's just getting started. And that brings us to the end of this deep dive. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration.
Until then, keep diving deep.